Hello and welcome to Catastrophe Chronicles, the podcast where history shakes things up, literally.
And where peaceful days turn into disasters faster than you can say, "What was that noise?"
Like in 1755, when Lisbon's All Saints' Day went from solemn prayers to collapsing buildings, towering waves, and raging infernos.
Talk about a real earth-shattering event.
You could say things got a little unstable.
I'll grab my hard hat.
Let's dig into the Great Earthquake of 1755. All right, here we go again. Yet another episode.
Super excited.
I'm really excited about this one. The 1755 earthquake was so much research. I had to condense it down quite a bit to fit it into one episode. But it was really cool. I'm really excited to tell you about it.
I can't wait to hear.
Yeah?
So before you go, what are we drinking tonight?
So I was gonna get a bottle of Madeira for tonight, which is a really famous wine in Portugal. And then I remembered that I don't like red wine.
That's right.
So I went and looked up fireball recipes because I figured with the big fire in this one, fire would be a fun one. And I found this fall, I forget what it's called. I don't think it has a name, but it's a fall fireball recipe. So it's grenadine, fireball, and ginger ale.
Interesting.
And cherries, because cherries are really famous in Portugal as well. There's a lot of
that's good.
popular cherries. It is good. It's a little weird, but I think it's tasty and it fits the theme, which is my whole goal. Cheesy, themey cocktails.
I love it.
You know, I'm a theme bitch. I love this stuff.
Bring it.
So are you ready?
I am so ready.
This week, I picked a quote from the great William Shakespeare.
Ooh.
I think this quote really encapsulates a lot of the disaster. So, earth gapes, hell burns, fiends roar, and saints pray. Richard III, Act 4, Scene 4.
Well, that's setting some kind of scene here.
You feel like you know what you're getting into?
I'm a little worried.
Good. That's what I want. So let's go. Lisbon, 1755. Lisbon was a city of glittering contradictions. It was known as the Queen of the Seas, and it was a place of incredible wealth and influence. Julius Caesar actually called it his happiness because he went and visited there a number of times and it was part of the Roman Empire.
Really?
Yeah, pretty cool. But by the 18th century, it was the third busiest port in Europe, trailing only Amsterdam and London.
Wow.
Over 1,000 ships a year came into Lisbon and went, carrying treasures from every corner of the world: sugar, spices, silks, gold, diamonds, emeralds, from colonies in Africa, India, and Brazil, and from other European nations like England, France, Spain, ships from all over. And yet, despite all of this wealth, much of Lisbon lived in squalor.
I mean, that sounds about par for the course.
Especially in the 18th century, but really, in general, there's the rich areas and the poor areas. But in Lisbon, it was particularly stark. There was over 20,000 ramshackle houses that filled the city. The streets were filled with human waste because the sewers were mainly only in the affluent districts.
Lovely.
Yep. And in true medieval fashion, people just toss their poop and pee right out the window onto the street.
Except this isn't medieval times.
You know, it's the bridge. It's definitely not straight in medieval times, but it's not that far out of it. And Lisbon certainly lagged behind the rest of Europe in terms of improving its infrastructure and improving its citizens' quality of life. Rich nobles, merchants, aristocrats would be carried around the city in sedan chairs by slaves to avoid stepping in the literal poop and pee that was on the streets. Adding to this, Lisbon was also unshakably religious. Dom Jose I, who had ascended to the throne in 1750, really embodied this devotion. He was deeply pious, as were his people, who filled the streets with crucifixes, images of saints, and niches for prayer. With well over 200 churches and religious shrines throughout the city, Lisbon was a spiritual labyrinth where nearly every street corner seemed to promise a miracle.
With all this religion, you'd think they'd be better to the poor people.
Would you? That's definitely not what I would think. I gotta be real honest with you here. 1 in 6 people in Lisbon were a member of the clergy, had taken holy orders of some sort. They were nuns, they were priests, they were some way. It was a lot. It was the largest ratio in Europe by far. Portugal as a whole was deeply religious as well. 1 in 10 people in the whole of Portugal had taken religious orders.
Wow.
I mean, that really gives you a full perspective of how deep the religious fervor went. It was intense. In Lisbon, however, faith was not just a personal matter. It was also enforced by fear and by law. The Portuguese Inquisition began operating in 1536, but by the mid-18th century, it was still a brutal and public institution.
Oh,
Jews,
good. Inquisition.
Yep, and Spain's Inquisition was still going on as well. The Inquisition was hopping. It was alive and well.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Nope. Jews and, quote, new Christians, and by new Christians we mean people who converted from a different religion, whether it's Judaism or Islam or something else, were still pretty routinely burned at the stake.
Oh, that's not severe at all.
Pogroms were still common. Do you know what a pogrom is?
No, actually.
It's raiding Jewish settlements. So at this time, there were no official Jewish settlements in Lisbon because it wasn't legal to be Jewish. But enclaves of new Christians, Jewish people who had converted, were relatively routinely attacked by the populace. It was brutal. The religious fervor went far more than just prayers. It was institutionalized hatred and institutionalized brutality. One of the Inquisition's most dramatic spectacles was something called the auto de fe, or act of faith. Now, the act of faith, picture in your mind a parade, the city's covered in flowers and ribbons, and then people being shooed down the street in long, flowing robes. The people walking down the street, flanked on either side by clergy and soldiers, were victims of the Inquisition. These are people who had been accused of religious crimes, whether it was not being Catholic enough, being Jewish, being Muslim, and they were being marched to their open-air trials where they would be tried, and then they would be sentenced, and then the sentences would be carried out.
Very Game of Thrones.
It feels a lot like Cersei and shame, shame, shame. And this was something that happened multiple times a month. They would either assign penance as a sentence, and by that it could be anything from doing public works to saying a rosary a couple times. Sometimes in an act of mercy, if they were found really guilty, they would be strangled and then burned. Or if they were really bad and didn't deserve mercy, they would just be burned at the stake in public squares. This was still happening.
That's horrifying.
So this was Lisbon in 1755, a city that celebrated saints while punishing sinners, and punishing them in public and pretty spectacular ways. While public executions were not uncommon or unheard of in Europe at this point, this was pretty beyond the pale. Most of Europe considered their religious fervor pretty backwards because this was also the era of the Enlightenment, at least for the majority of Northern Europe. And the Enlightenment was a period of time where reason and science began to gain more of a foothold over religion. Enlightenment literally means holding things to the light, seeing if they hold up to the light of reason and truth, or if they're just superstitious nonsense. Despite all of this religiosity,
Nice use of the phrase.
You're welcome. Lisbon also had an incredibly seedy underbelly. Lisbon was the queen of the seas. It was a port town where there are sailors.
There are whorehouses.
There's sex workers. Sailors, day laborers, and the occasional nobleman fueled a thriving sex trade. In fact, prostitution was so rampant that a lot of respectable, quote, women would lock themselves indoors at all times to avoid any hint of scandal and to avoid any risk of venereal disease.
Because you catch that just walking down the street.
Apparently. Though, think they were getting up to something? Maybe. In fact, venereal disease was so widespread that convert life became an appealing escape for many women. Join a nunnery.
Lock yourself away in a cloister.
Despite that, nunneries actually often had pretty vulgar plays and musicals in them. The religion, it was there. It was definitely a pious city, but there was the real contradiction of there was also a lot of, what these religious people would consider sin. While the city clung to its faith, its wealth came pouring in from across the globe. Lisbon's colonial empire stretched over 4 different continents. In the 1720s, massive diamond and emerald deposits were discovered in Brazil. These riches became an absolute obsession for the Portuguese elite. King Jose was known to just casually give his friends cups full of diamonds.
A generous friend.
Very generous friend. And a lot of Lisbon's aristocracy mirrored this level of extravagance. Because most of the wealth invested in Lisbon was not reinvested into the city or any kind of infrastructure. It stayed in the hands of the merchant class, of the noblemen, of people who were able to get their hands on it in the first place.
Why should they share?
Why should they share? And that wealth did not protect Lisbon from the disasters that it seemed pretty cursed to endure. Earthquakes, famines, and tsunamis had all struck Portugal repeatedly over the centuries. From 1309 to 1404, the country suffered 22 famines, 11 earthquakes. The most devastating earthquake before 1755 occurred in January 1531, and it leveled over 1,500 buildings, triggering a tsunami as well.
Well, all that piety is doing them a world of good.
This was Lisbon of 1755. It was a city of saints and of sailors, miracles and executions, diamonds and dirt.
That's good. I like that.
Thank you. I wrote it myself. The city really was just glittering contradictions, and I cannot emphasize that enough. And I feel like it plays into a lot of the rest of the story. And it's one of the things I really loved about my research was when I picture Inquisition times in any country, I don't picture these levels of contradictions, this amount of really polar opposites existing in the same space. On top of that, when I think about the age of discovery, the age of exploration, and the amount of wealth and riches that flowed into these countries, I don't picture medieval level squalor.
And the thing that's getting me here is you said 1755.
1755. This is...
It's like 20 years before the American Revolution.
It is. It's actually during the French and Indian War. A few days before this disaster occurs, news of Braddock's defeat, which was a pretty major battle in the French and Indian War, had just reached Portugal.
My mind is having trouble containing that right there.
I like that kind of stuff, though, where it all comes together, man. Love hearing it when it all comes together. So that's where we are, Lisbon, 1755. The days leading up to November 1st felt strange and even foreboding, whether you were a man of science or a man of religious fervor.
Now, why is that?
For the religious fervor folks, there were things like really strange crickets emerging on the coast of Africa, crickets that very much resembled crickets that emerged after an earthquake in Peru in 1746. There was a whale spotted in the Lisbon harbor, which apparently is a bad omen. Don't know why. There was a creepy comet spotted in the sky within a few days of the disaster that happened. And all of these were unsettling to people. There was already kind of
bad omens.
Some bad feels flowing. For those of us of the more scientific mindset, there was two small rattlers, two small earthquakes that shook Portugal on October 31st, the day before the disaster. On the morning of the disaster, all of the wells, or many of the wells, in Portugal and Spain ran dry. Many rivers lost their current. And for those of us who are from California, we know what this means.
It's not good.
All of the animals went crazy.
Oh, yep.
They all started acting incredibly fearful very quickly on the morning of November 1st. For most of Lisbon's citizens, however, these warnings went unnoticed or ignored. When the day dawned on November 1st, 1755, it was stunningly beautiful. It was in the mid-60s. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. There was a gentle breeze blowing through the city. You really couldn't have asked for a more perfect November day. November 1st is the Feast of All Saints. It was a holy day of obligation for Catholics. And in this case, that didn't just mean you have to go to Mass. It was a giant party, an all-day-long giant party. By mid-morning of November 1st, thousands of people dressed in their finest clothes crowded into all of Lisbon's grand churches. Others were streaming through the streets, hurrying to catch the 10 o'clock Mass. Meanwhile, Lisbon's nobility and the royal family were safely away in Belém, which was a little suburb just outside of Lisbon, across the river. For those in the city, life felt busy, but peaceful. It was a great start to the morning. You really couldn't have asked for better. Until the sound started.
Ooh.
They were deep, hollow, and almost distant, like thunder rolling beneath the ground. And that's a quote from one of the eyewitnesses. It grew louder and started to sound more like loud cannon fire or drums beating. Seconds later, the ground started to move underneath them. At first, it was subtle, kind of like a wagon rolling over stones.
Mm-hmm.
But within moments, the tremors became exceptionally violent, and they were tossing buildings and people and horses and carts around like they were toys. One of the things I picture most, and one of the things that's talked about most in the eyewitness reports, is the idea of these thousands of people that were crowded into these churches, and they would have been surrounded by the smell of incense, soft murmuring prayers, flickering candles when the earthquake started. And then suddenly the ground starts to shake. The chandeliers are shaking, they're swaying, cracks start forming in the side of the building. There's screaming, and very quickly, a lot of the roofs of these churches, because again, these are wide open buildings that don't have anything to protect them from earthquakes, start falling in on these, again, exceptionally religious people, burying them. They became tombs. They became absolute death traps. The first tremor only lasted 2 minutes, but it was enough to turn Lisbon into a charnel house. Churches, once seen as places of refuge, really did become tombs. Those lucky enough to not be inside scrambled to try to escape. The air was so thick, described by eyewitnesses, that it started to choke people out. And you have to imagine the amount of dust and just crap in the air would have been enough to suffocate quite a people. Literally crap. After that first quake, we weren't done yet.
Oh.
After about a minute break.
Worse.
It does. This is another one but wait, there's more. After that first quake, though, there's a minute break, give or take. And then the second one starts. And the second one is even longer than the first and even more destructive than the first. And at this point, you've already had hundreds of buildings fall. But the buildings that haven't fallen yet are damaged. So you definitely have more buildings falling. You have people running through the street trying to escape. You have people who are in shock and disoriented. You have chaos. Absolute, pure, and unrelenting chaos in the streets.
Earthquakes are scary.
They're very scary. And this one...
And then buildings falling on you are scary too.
Buildings falling into the street. I mean, just the amount of rubble already. And more is falling, more is falling. The second tremor lasted about 2.5 minutes. In the Baxia district, which was Lisbon's main commercial hub, this is when the sandy foundation started to liquefy, which is something that happens in earthquakes when there's soil or sandy, sediment underneath buildings or wherever. With enough shaking, that can start to liquefy if there's water in it. And again, this is a city on a river. So in the main commercial hub, a lot of the sandy soil that it was built on started to liquefy, and pieces of that would just fall into the river or just sink down and collapse underneath the ground entirely. And then it stopped for a minute.
Of course.
Before starting up again for a third quake. And during this third quake, you started to see things like fissures opening up in the ground. Eyewitness reports talk about up to 16 feet. Fissures, huge fissures opening up into the ground, more buildings falling over, more buildings falling into the river, just absolute, pure destruction.
I mean, they had to be thinking that, the world itself was ending. This was revelation.
You absolutely had to be thinking that. I can't imagine that a religious city could be thinking much different, at least not in that moment. We'll get to more of that later, but in that moment, yeah, I think most people thought this was the end of the world. The aftermath of the earthquake alone was absolutely unimaginable. Survivors described streets being littered with crushed bodies. Many of them were completely unrecognizable between their injuries and the dust and blood that were on them. A German merchant wrote that there were half-naked women and children running aimlessly, their faces caked with dirt and their eyes wild with terror. One survivor recalled stepping over the dead with every single step. Mothers clutching their infants, horses and their riders crushed together, nobles in gilded carriages reduced to nothing but mangled remains.
Whoa.
You feeling good yet? Feeling comfy? You want another drink?
Oh, yeah.
Take another drink. Take another drink.
I'm going to need it to carry on with this one.
I think you are. Inside of the ruins, cries for help echoed, desperate and just completely unrelenting. Most survivors recall the majority of citizens calling out literally, "Mercy, mercy." Despite being such a religious city, self-preservation was very much the name of the game at this point. There are multiple reports of parents abandoning their children, children abandoning their parents, friends abandoning friends, spouses abandoning each other. Everyone was just really...
I mean, what do you do?
Or I should say many people were just looking out for themselves. And I can't say I don't understand it.
What do you do in the face of abject terror?
And assuming that God is smiting you like Babylon.
Yeah.
I fully believe that most people believed that that was happening at this point. God was coming for them. One of the stories that particularly stood out to me that I read about was the Dutch ambassador. He and his family was saved when the governess's pet monkey started screeching like an absolute crazy pants. And it woke them up because they hadn't woken up yet. That's when the shaking started, and they were able to get outside relatively quickly because they were woken up and out of bed
Saved by the
screaming
monkey.
Crazy monkey. Another story that really stuck out to me was there was one priest. He ended up being buried in his church, and the other clergy members weren't. They went in, they pulled him out of the wreckage, and all of them, covered in blood, immediately started hearing confessions, giving last rites, and generally comforting the people around. Good story.
Yeah, that's a good story.
I figured I had to throw you one like that since I threw you that parents were abandoning their children. Another one that really stuck out to me was Jose Manuel de Camara. He was the cardinal, the highest level of the church at that point. He was in bed with dysentery because his day already wasn't bad enough.
It's a shitty day.
It's a literal shitty day. His entire house collapsed around him, and he was trapped inside of his house.
With dysentery. He ended up being rescued by two very quick-thinking servants who pulled him out, found a chair, tied him to the chair, and carried him out of the city through this chaos. And that one just stuck out to me because, like, what a shitty day. You've got dysentery. You're already not feeling great. And then your whole ass house collapses on top of you, and you get tied to a chair and carried out through carnage. Why they tied him? Was he unconscious?
I don't know why they tied him, but they tied him to it. I imagine it was probably a combination of injuries, and the man just wasn't feeling great. Sitting up straight may not have been easy for him. To bring it back down for you, though, within the first hour or so of the quake, it's estimated that around 10,000 people died in Lisbon alone.
Holy crap.
Yep. Lisbon was unrecognizable. Already, before we've even gotten to the other two-part of this three-parter disaster, 2/3 of the buildings of the city had been destroyed. Homes were gone. Tons of churches, monasteries, and schools completely gone, completely destroyed. Streets in the commercial district had, again, liquefied and just fallen to pieces or fallen into the river. It wasn't just Lisbon. This earthquake's reach was absolutely mind-boggling. It could be felt over 5.8 million square miles across the globe. That's 3% of the Earth's surface.
Jeez.
People felt it as far north as Norway. They felt it deeply into West Africa. This was a huge, massive, enormous earthquake. Modern estimates put it at about 8.5 to 9.1 magnitude.
Ooh, that's fucking massive.
It's one of the most powerful earthquakes in the history of the globe. But what made it truly destructive was its duration, how long it lasted. There was roughly 8 to 9 minutes of shaking, just shaking. To put that in perspective, do you remember?
Long.
It's so long. Do you remember the 2010 earthquake in Haiti?
Absolutely.
That earthquake only lasted 35 seconds, and it was only a 7.0.
Oh my God.
This earthquake had the energy of 32,000 Hiroshima bombs. 32,000 bombs. It's hard to comprehend the amount of power that Mother Nature put behind that earthquake.
Fuck Lisbon.
Fuck. Fuck the globe. This earthquake, we're going to get into it more, but this disaster spanned multiple places. Lisbon definitely is the one we talk about the most, primarily because it was a capital city in Europe. But there was lots of places that were devastated by this. 61 people in Spain died. Multiple people died in Africa. This was a worldwide event. Because the earthquake wasn't enough, nature really kind of seemed determined to show that the sea was just as vengeful as the earth.
Aye, she a cruel mistress.
She is a cruel mistress.
One of the most haunting quotes that I found was from a French eyewitness, and referring to what happened next, he said, "The sea seemed jealous that people thought they had less to fear from her than the earth and the fire."
Not good.
It's very not good. Things are not going well. I want to remind you, people are running. People are trying to find any safe space that they can. While the main quakes have stopped at this point, the 3 biggest ones happened. There was multiple small aftershocks, so there was still little shaking happening every couple of minutes. And people were trying their best to just get to open spaces where they felt that they would be safe from falling debris. Many of the open spaces in the city were public squares on the riverfront.
Right next to the water.
Right next to the water. And about 40 minutes after the last big quake ended, people noticed that the Tagus River was starting to pull out. It was getting lower and lower and lower. And like we saw in the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, people didn't know what that meant. They didn't know that the water receding like that was a precursor to, you guessed it,
Tidal wave.
Tsunami. So we have hundreds and hundreds of people gathered at the shore of the Tagus River. The water is going out, and about 10 minutes after people start seeing the river bottom, ships are grounded, the water comes back in. It was nothing short of apocalyptic. The tsunami was eventually known as the Great Tsunami, and it struck with really just overwhelming power. The waves rushed into the Tagus River, into the heart of the city. They flooded streets. They caused panic among already really shell-shocked survivors of the earthquake. The water rose so high that it overtopped some of the river buildings. It washed away boats. It drowned hundreds in its wake. For those that had fled to the riverbanks, they were, for the most part, just wiped away. Some people tried to climb on top of the rubble to escape the rising waters, and they were still washed away. The water was moving at about 50 miles an hour. It could outpace a horse.
Oh, my God.
One of the good things we can say about this is the way Lisbon's geography is, the Tagus River narrows when it enters the Atlantic Ocean. If that entry, that part of the river that goes into the Atlantic Ocean was wider, this would have been a whole lot worse.
So it kind of blunted the force of the
It blunted a lot
tsunami.
of the force. It was still pretty awful. It extended about 1,000 some odd feet from the river's sides into the city, which is still, that's a lot, but that's not the whole of Lisbon. It only took out the riverbanks. It could have taken out a lot more. So I guess, I mean, there's not much in this story that you can say it could have been worse, but this is one. It could have been worse. One witness described it seeming like the river wanted to swallow the entire city whole. Like the river was now a wolf with its mouth open, coming in and devouring everything in its path. Yeah, a lot of these quotes, or just the descriptions of them, are absolutely haunting. It's a lot. Much like the earthquake, this was not only a local disaster. The tsunami hit 4 different continents, and it caused fatalities on 4 different continents.
That's an overachiever.
It really was. The Americas, Europe, and Africa all had fatalities due to this tsunami. And Africa, while we don't have as pristine records for Africa at this time, was definitely hit the worst. Entire villages and cities were wiped off of the map. There was most likely at least 10,000 people that were killed in Africa from this. In Spain, I mentioned before, 61 people died from the earthquake. At least 1,200 people died from the tsunami in Spain. The tsunami, there's records of it hitting Newfoundland, Canada, and caused at least 1 fatality there. It also hit decently hard in Brazil. Now, in Brazil, it only caused a few fatalities because, again, thankfully, it hit pretty deserted beaches. But it hit Brazil. Like, it was the entire Atlantic Ocean, basically.
Wow.
Yeah. Mother Nature is not our friend sometimes.
Not playing around.
She does not fuck around. Tsunamis are typically most often caused by underwater earthquakes when 2 plates come together and then one plate ends up going under the other and one plate goes up. That pushes hundreds to thousands of tons of seawater up. And that's what causes the tsunami. And that's what happened in the Lisbon earthquake. Except in the Lisbon earthquake, there was 3 movements of the plates because there was 3 separate earthquakes.
Good.
So there were 3 large tsunamis.
That was just the first wave.
That was just the first wave. And I'm not going to get into as many details about the second and third, but it's about the same. It happened 3 times. And then ripples in the ocean keep going. So there was 3 big ones, but then there was ripples as the water would go up and down throughout the day.
Oh my God.
And at this point, if you can call it a break, Lisbon was getting a little bit of a break. Not much, but a little bit. While they were catching their breath, as these waves were starting to calm down and slow down, hundreds, thousands of little fires had started, and they were starting to spread. When the earthquake hit, thousands of candles were thrown down in churches into holy oil. Thousands of cook fires were overturned.
It's a holy fire.
It is literally a holy fire. These little flames were being fanned by these little aftershocks that were happening as well. They were also being fanned by the slight breeze that was so precious when the morning started.
Oh. You turned the one good thing.
I turned the one good thing into a bad thing. This disaster is really, really good at that. They started as a little bit of a spark, but as the hours passed and the destruction, the rubble, the chaos piled up, so too did the fires start to grow and grow and grow. By late afternoon, the flames were beginning to completely rage out of control, and they were threatening to consume the entire city.
Can you just imagine?
You've finally taken a breath, and now it's all on fucking fire.
Your world collapses down around your ears from earthquakes. A fucking tsunami comes, 3 of them, and washes all your friends away.
Now you're on fire.
And then it lights on fire.
It catches on fire. Yeah, it was kind of the worst day. The worst day. So whenever you feel like you're having a bad day, I'm just going to remind you, at least you're not November 1st, Lisbon, 1755.
Yeah, that'll make everything better.
It could be worse. As this fire was spreading, the priests and clergy of Lisbon were this really interesting mess of trying to do everything they could to help. And sometimes that looked like the priest I had talked about earlier who was trying to comfort his congregation. And some of it looked like priests standing on street corners calling Lisbon Babylon and yelling at the people that it was their fault for their sins.
How dare they?
How dare they? So there's a fire raging. There's clergy doing all kinds of different things. People are running around. People are running into churches to try and save themselves because there were some churches that were still standing. And this fire kept growing and growing and growing. The city with its narrow streets and really crowded neighborhoods was absolutely like a tinderbox. Once these flames really started to catch hold and spread, there was nothing they could do to stop them. There was no fire brigade. Most of what counted as a fire brigade at that time was people with buckets tossing water on fires.
And most of them are dead now.
And their buckets are buried. The other thing people could do was knock down buildings to make fire breaks. Well, most of the buildings are knocked down. There wasn't anything anyone could really do. There was no stopping this. And because that day was quite literally perfect for a fire, it quickly grew into what's known as a firestorm. Do you know what a firestorm is?
Yes, vaguely, because I remember there being a firestorm in California.
There was pretty recently, and it's a pretty rare phenomenon. It takes a lot of things going right for the fire for it to happen. One of the biggest things is there being enough to burn. And in Lisbon at this point, there was plenty to burn. And the more it burns, the hotter it gets, the more that hot air rises. As that hot air rises, cool air gets pulled into the bottom of the firestorm, gets heated up and rises. And in that way, it creates this cyclical wind, creates its own wind system.
Because it needs more oxygen, so it sucks it into itself, right?
It needs more oxygen, and that's definitely part of it, but it's also that hot air rising. Hot air rises, and when it rises, it leaves a vacuum. Yeah, that vacuum is now sucking in all of the cold air from around it or cooler air from around it, and with that, sucking in the oxygen. And when you suck in that oxygen and you move it up and you do this cycle, you create your own wind system, but you also create a vacuum all around that sucks air out of everything. So people and animals were suffocating without being burned because all of the oxygen was being sucked away. With this windstorm, it also created fire whirls or fire tornadoes that sprung out throughout the city, whipping destruction everywhere they went.
Fire-nados.
I told you there was going to be fire-nados. These are the fire-nados. So literally its own weather system. Absolute insanity. It was so hot that coinage was melting. Some of the rocks and marble were melting. It got upwards of 1,800 degrees
Good
Fahrenheit.
God.
It was hotter than most ovens. So this firestorm is almost literally impossible to escape. The heat was so intense that it was sucking the oxygen out.
Straight out of people's lungs.
Straight
That's
out of people's
crazy.
lungs. Excavations of some of the mass graves that happened found that people's skulls got so hot they literally popped.
Huh.
I mean, I'm going to move past that because it's horrific what happened to these people. It wasn't just buildings and people and animals that were destroyed. These firenadoes, this firestorm was sending hot ash throughout the air. And some of the few ships that survived the 3 different tsunamis had hot ash land on them. So
And
now
caught
there's
fire?
ships burning in the
Oh,
harbor.
God.
The city's on fire. The ships are on fire. Everything's
never
on fucking
ends.
fire. No, the main fire lasted about 5 days.
5 days.
5 days.
Oh.
But there were still fires
God.
burning weeks after they got the main inferno down. Weeks. And before you give me that look and act like I'm a little bit crazy, I want you to remember on 9/11, there were still fires burning 3 months after the towers fell.
Oof.
Fires can last a long time in basements if there's things for it to burn. And like on 9/11, there was plenty to burn. So there were plenty of fires that they found weeks after the main fire went out. Once everything finally began to subside, though, the scale of the devastation was just astronomical. Many who had managed to escape the fires had no home. They had made it to the fields that were outside of Lisbon. They had nothing with them, though. They couldn't carry anything out quickly enough. They didn't have anything more than the clothes on their back, if they even had that.
Right. The previous quote about half-naked people.
The death toll from the Lisbon disaster was just absolutely staggering to the majority of Western civilization. It was probably the most shocking event that had happened since the fall of Rome. In Lisbon, somewhere between 40 to 60,000 people alone died. Worldwide, though, the death toll is somewhere between 60 and 75,000. That's a lot.
It's a
It's
lot
a lot
of people.
anytime, but it's a lot in the mid-18th century. There were not as many people alive at that point. 60 to 75,000 people worldwide is unbelievable. Financially, the story wasn't much better. In today's money, the damage was somewhere between $9.8 to $10.7 trillion worth of damages.
Oh.
To put that in some perspective, the largest natural disaster that happened in the United States was Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina caused $100 billion in damage, an absolute fraction of what this caused.
Yeah, that's orders of magnitude greater.
Just one building, the Casa de India warehouse, was filled with nothing but Brazilian diamonds, and it accounted for over 3% of Portugal's GDP. And that entire building slid into the river. Just diamonds slid
Just
into the river.
gone.
I often wonder if anyone went diving for those diamonds.
I kind of feel like some merchant or nobleman sent some poor soul to go dive and
You
try
would
and find
think,
them.
but also, like, do you remember the Mary Rose and talking about that ship that sunk
Uh-huh.
off the coast of England and how it took over 100 years for them to find it again?
Oh, yeah.
And the
Oh.
Mary Rose was a much bigger ship.
Oh, I got a story
Then.
coming up for you
I'm ready.
that deals with some of that.
Good. I'm excited to hear it. The city lost between 54 and 59% of its entire GDP. It was devastated. The entire country was devastated. There was almost no coming back from that. Ironically, however, one of the very few streets that survived was a street called Dirty Street. Can you guess what was housed on
Dirty
Dirty
Street.
Street?
The brothels.
It was the best brothel street in the entire city, and it sustained almost no damage.
So in this city, on this Catholic holy day, the churches are decimated and the best brothels still stand.
And the best brothels still
Oh
stand.
my God.
Can you imagine what the people were thinking?
That
It's hard to put yourself in their mindset and what could have been going through their mind.
I imagine that there was a lot that was shaken that day.
But before we go into more of the aftermath of disaster, I did want to talk about one particular person, Thomas Chase. He was an English merchant who was in Lisbon at the time. He was in his home on the 4th story when the first earthquake hit. When the first earthquake hit, the entire house collapsed around him. like it did to many people. His shoulder ended up being dislocated. His arm was broken. It was not great. He crawled his way out of this, managed to get himself to the street, and was found eventually by his neighbor, a man named Mr. Forg, who pulled him into his house and took care of him and tried to save him. Mr. Forg managed to get Thomas all the way to one of these public squares that we talked about. And the reason I want to tell this story, there's a lot more to it, but one of the parts I thought was the most just crazy. Thomas Chase talks about when he's on this public square, Mr. Forg had gone to try and find more help. He was watching as people tried to figure out what to do. Their hair was getting singed by the fire. The fire had surrounded the square almost entirely. Their eyebrows were being singed. Packages of people's possessions that they had managed to get out were starting to catch on fire. It really looked like everything was just, he was going to die at that point. While all of this happens, he sees a woman run directly into the flames.
That's
and then she runs back out.
What?
Completely unharmed with a bottle of wine. Thomas Chase and this, he figures out.
We're dying anyway, so might as well drink.
She's Irish. She comes and sits down next to him and they share the bottle of wine before Mr. Ford comes back and gets Thomas out of this area. But like, how bizarre. And I know all disasters have these bizarre moments, but that one just really stuck with me, that this woman ran out to get wine and then she sat down with a stranger and shared a bottle of wine with him as the entire city is burning and falling apart around them.
I mean,
that blows your mind, right?
What are you going to do?
What are you going to do? Run into fire and get the wine. Almost made me do wine tonight, but then I remembered again, I don't like red wine. So this is not, I'd run out for the vodka. That brings us to the end of the disaster itself.
What a disaster.
I feel like this is one of the crazier ones of the disaster portion that we'll cover throughout this podcast, because this is, it's a 3-for-1.
Just so much.
So much. And when you put it in the perspective of what a religious city it was, and then the street with the brothels didn't burn down, and how much it reflects revelations in the Bible, it's a lot, and just really, really interesting, I think.
It's a lot.
One other thing I wanted to add at this point, just because I thought it was really cool. On November 2nd, a little baby was born in Vienna. And this little girl was the goddaughter of the King and Queen of Portugal. You might know her as Marie Antoinette.
No joke.
Isn't that crazy? Marie Antoinette was born the day after, and she was the goddaughter of the King and Queen of Portugal.
That's wild.
Yeah, so again, putting it all in perspective, giving you a big idea. After the earthquake, reconstruction and everything that happened was incredibly complex. One of the most striking people that emerged from that was a man named, you gotta forgive me if I mispronounce this, Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo. We're going to refer to him by his title.
That's a long-ass name.
That's a long name. He is mostly known as the Marquis de Pombal. So we're going to refer to him as Pombal. Now, Pombal was a man who had spent his entire life climbing both the social and political ladder. He had had a few advantageous marriages, and he was just incredibly ambitious, incredibly smart. He worked his butt off to get higher in the government.
A few marriages? What happened?
His first wife died, and then he remarried. It wasn't anything salacious or anything like that. But
I was just picturing some Henry VIII nonsense.
Nope, no Henry VIII here. It was crazy at the time that this little country nobleman was able to get 2 very rich, very powerful women to marry him, but not enough to at least make any real impression on the history books beyond, wow, good job. At the time of the earthquake, he was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and War. Before that, he had served as an ambassador to England and as a special envoy to Austria. When he spent time overseas, he was really infected with the Enlightenment fever. Pombal was not a religious man. Now, he was Catholic, but he very strongly believed in the Enlightenment ideas. He was very much secularist, and much of what he did after the disaster reflects that. On the day of the disaster, he was in Lisbon. He got on his horse as soon as he could, and he rode as fast as he could to the king to tell the king what had happened. When he got there, he found a king who was completely paralyzed with fear. Before this, Dom Jose, the king, was not a bad king, but he was definitely more interested in the lighter parts of life, music, women, giving his friends cups full of diamonds. Right. He wasn't really interested in governance. Pombal had already been pulling a lot of the strings and he had made a lot of enemies, but he had already put himself in quite a position of power at this point. And when he realized that the king was so paralyzed, he managed very quickly to get the king to essentially sign over all power to him to be able to handle this disaster. Pombal is often referred to as the fourth disaster that Lisbon had to face. Now, a lot of what he did after the disaster was really modern and really made a huge difference in a good way to Portugal, but he also kind of became a dictator and was pretty brutal. So again, in a city of contradictions, they get a man full of contradictions to lead them out of this disaster, which seems pretty fitting. One quote that's directly attributed to Pombal was that he said, in response to the disaster, that they needed to bury the dead and feed the living. This is almost certainly not something he actually said, but the quote does encompass the way that he approached everything. He did not approach it from a religious viewpoint. He approached it from a secular one. We need to make sure that the bodies are buried so that we don't have problems from that. And we need to make sure the people that survived keep surviving.
Practical.
Very practical. In that vein, he obviously opposed the belief that the disaster was caused by God. He very quickly issued a proclamation that prohibited any, quote, provocative utterances, meaning the clergy was no longer allowed to sermonize that this was God's fault.
You can't
Lisbon,
be screaming fire and brimstone.
You can't. You can't tell Lisbon that it's their fault anymore. This, of all of his orders, was the most ignored. There's not much you can do about that. But that was one of the first ones he did. He also immediately called in the army from the surrounding areas that had survived the earthquake, because again, this hit most of Portugal. He had them bring as many prefabricated homes, blankets, and supplies that they could carry.
Sounds like a good move.
As soon as they got there, he also sent them out to patrol the city. During the earthquake, 3 of the city's prisons were destroyed and hundreds of inmates escaped. So in those first couple of days, couple of hours, there was tons of looting and violence. In fact, there's a lot of reports of criminals starting fires to distract survivors and chase them away from their homes when they were trying to retrieve items so that they could loot those homes and get more of those items. So he sent out the army and he sent them out with orders that they could immediately not only arrest, but execute any looters, rioters, anyone who was doing anything they weren't supposed to do. Brutal.
Make an example.
But it was efficient. It stopped a lot of the violence very, very quickly. Pombal also started the very first field hospital.
Really?
The Hospital of All Saints was in Lisbon and it unfortunately burned down, so they didn't have an official hospital anymore. So he took one of the palaces that didn't burn down on the outskirts of Lisbon, and survivors would be brought there and they would be triaged into different categories. And depending on their category was how they would be treated. The majority of medical services were being provided by priests at this point. Because number one, there weren't a lot of actual real doctors around. And number two, the ones that were around mostly died. The clergy did most of the medical work that needed to be done in some of the first field hospitals. I thought it was pretty cool.
Now, were there categories like crushed, wet, toasty?
I don't think those were the categories, but good question. One of the other orders he gave right away was to bury the dead as quickly as possible. Again, back to that quote. He went to the church leadership and asked for essentially a dispensation because at the time, Christians needed to be buried in their own funeral service. And that wasn't going to go well. And at the time,
that's too many people.
There's way too many
people. Don't have
people.
the time for that.
While they didn't have a firm understanding of germ theory, they did know that dead bodies could spread disease. So he was able to quickly get a dispensation from the clergy of the city to have mass graves. They also would fill ships with bodies and sink them in the harbor or set them aflame out in the ocean. And they got rid of the bodies relatively quickly.
Just picturing the largest Viking funeral.
Pretty much, and more than one of them. There was multiple ships that were set out and sent on fire or sunk or whatever it was, buried at sea. This was one of the first disasters that wasn't followed by plague. There were diseases that broke out. There was lots of bugs. The lice were actually considered, quote, supernatural going through the camps.
Supernatural lice.
Supernatural because they were so bad.
But
gross. There was no excessive disease like you would normally see after a disaster like this. Like you saw after Haiti, like you saw after the 2004 earthquake.
Yeah.
Even in modern times, we still see that. And Portugal didn't. There was not a huge outbreak of disease, largely because the cleanup effort was so quick and swift, and because he was able to follow a lot of those scientific reasonings. Another part of Pombal's vision for rebuilding is he sought to transform Lisbon from this medieval city into a modern one. He wanted it to be a model for all of Europe. He had plans commissioned to completely rebuild the city in a different way. So not giving people back the land that they had their homes on, but to completely change the setup of the entire city. The new plans called for a grid layout, which avoided a lot of those narrow, winding, spaghetti-like streets of medieval times. The new design was really heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. It favored a lot of symmetry, utility, and it also favored public health because in a city with grid lines, you can have sewer systems really easily.
No more shit street.
No more shit streets. Part of what he did when he commissioned the plans for the city is he also consulted public health experts on what they could do to make the city more hygienic, and they instituted most of those policies. Pombal obviously introduced sewer systems. He introduced wider streets, which allowed for better ventilation and better evacuation. He installed fireproofing methods that would prevent further fires. And one of the biggest things that he really pushed for, he didn't design it himself, but he worked with other scientists to get their ideas and experimentation. But they designed something called the Pombaline cage construction method. This is one of the first earthquake-proofing methods we had for buildings.
I'm finding it difficult to find a lot or anything bad that
we're not going to get into a ton of Pombal's worst tendencies because a lot of his worst tendencies came later in his time in power. But know that he was a dictator eventually. And I guess if you want to hear a really bad one, in the early stages of the disaster, he also cordoned off the entire city, wasn't allowing people to leave. And he told all of the army members and ministers to find people who were, quote, loitering or just hanging around, they weren't doing anything, and to find trumped-up reasons to charge them, and then sentence them to cleanup duty, because he didn't feel there was enough people cleaning up the city. And if you were able-bodied, and then people couldn't leave, he didn't want people to abandon the city. So, yeah, sorry, side note, that's pretty brutal. But the Pombaline cages were cool.
Yeah.
The Pombaline cages were buildings that were framed with wooden beams that were arranged in this grid-like pattern, and that grid pattern allowed them to absorb the shaking of the earth. So the building itself would stay up. The facade, the front of the building, might fall off, but the interior walls and most of the outside walls wouldn't fall down. It prevented buildings from completely collapsing. Probably wouldn't have worked in an earthquake the size of 1755, but in the majority of earthquakes, it does keep buildings standing.
Yeah, that's definitely better than they had.
Very much, very much. And a lot of that philosophy in earthquake proofing is still used today in our buildings.
Well, that's fascinating.
His approach to building extended all the way to architecture as well, the way the city looked. He did not want any more ostentatious palaces. He did not want any more ostentatious churches. He limited the number of churches in Lisbon significantly. And those churches that were allowed were not allowed to be huge cathedrals. They had to conform to these soft white marble facades that the rest of the city center had.
Huh.
One of the effects of rebuilding the city the way Pombal did really made it easier for the merchant class, the middle class, to get more value in the city center because everything was being redone. So you had to buy your property anew. The merchant class was the only class that really had ready funds available. They had diamonds in their pocket ready to go. A lot of the aristocracy's wealth was tied up into their land holdings, and offloading those in an economy that had completely tanked versus bringing it in from Brazil, hard to do. So a lot of the merchant class was able to take over a lot of this downtown area. Between that and the fact that these huge ostentatious palaces were no longer allowed, it helped boost the middle class, the merchant class, even further than it was already being boosted, which again served to change a lot of the societal structure of Lisbon.
And probably helped our economy out a lot too.
It did definitely help their economy out a lot. The Lisbon earthquake also triggered this really profound philosophical debate that echoed all the way across Europe. Philosophers like Voltaire, Kant, Rousseau all chimed in on it. And the debate was really what you would think. Was it God or was it nature? Was it science or was it Jesus? I'm not going to get into a ton of detail of what they talked about, but there was a lot of really interesting discussion between all of them. Voltaire tended to land on the side of God sucks. This had to have been a natural disaster, but God really sucks. Why was it Lisbon? Why not London? If it was just God making that choice, how would he have made it? And why didn't he just take out all the European cities? On the other hand, Rousseau ended up landing in this really interesting place where he said, maybe it was God, maybe it wasn't, but at the end of the day, it's really humanity's fault. And not for the reason you think. It's humanity's fault for not being one with nature. If humanity was more spread out the way they were intended to be, less people would have died.
Interesting.
And there was lots of different pieces to that discussion that went all the way through, and a lot of pieces that were both about God or about it being science, but also about how man should be living. Should man be living in cities? And this disaster echoed across the entirety of society and really helped shape a lot of these big discussions that were being had in the Enlightenment at that time and moved these discussions forward in really fascinating ways that echoed through. I mean, it even echoed into our own country's constitution. These discussions were being had at the table of the founding forefathers. This had to have been a topic of conversation and influenced some decisions that were made there. So the legacy of this earthquake is incredibly far-reaching. It's a turning point in the history of disaster response, in urban planning, in philosophical thought. Pomball's efforts to rebuild Lisbon not only saved the city, but it also really set a new standard on how societies could recover from disasters. You don't have to have plagues. You don't have to have unbridled looting and rioting. It can go smoothly. Now, you might have to be kind of brutal to get there, but if you approach it logically and you approach it from a more secular standpoint, it can go well. In the years that followed, Lisbon was completely rebuilt as a real model of Enlightenment principles. The lesson learned from the earthquake really do continue to shape a lot of how we approach natural disasters. Lisbon is considered the first modern earthquake for a reason. The response to it was a very modern response. It was not, you're Babylon, suck it up. It was very modern. So to kind of wrap up the story and a couple of other little things I wanted to throw in, one of the other things I read about while I was researching this that I found really interesting was that in 1750, so 5 years before the Lisbon earthquake, England actually had this like mass hysteria event. There was a priest named Mitchell who put out essentially that God told him that he was going to destroy London in an earthquake on April 3rd, maybe April 4th. And tons of people believed it. Over 100,000 people evacuated London on April 3rd and didn't come back because they thought the end of the world was coming.
Oh my goodness.
You remember all those, like, you've seen those people on the side of the street holding up signs,
oh, yeah.
The end is real. That was happening in the mid-18th century as well, to the point that people were literally escaping. And it just makes me think of Y2K and like that whole 2012 stuff.
Yeah.
And then 5 years after that, Lisbon falls.
Yeah.
That had to have blown some people's minds. And the last...
He just got the city wrong.
He just got the wrong city. The Lisbon earthquake also serves as this real kind of historical marker on how we perceive faith and how we perceive science. Just to put other things in perspective, the last person burned to death as a heretic in Spain was in 1826. The last person burned by the Inquisition about 75 years after the Lisbon earthquake. Is that not crazy?
That's after America was founded.
That was the last person burned to death as a heretic. We like to think we've come a really, really long way and that we're not as superstitious as we were and that this event really did change everything. And in a lot of ways, it did move a lot of things forward and a lot of things have changed. But it's also important to remember that we're not that far off from being that superstitious. It's something to keep in mind as we move forward. And with that, the Lisbon fault, the fault that's right off of Lisbon that caused the earthquake, is still active. It could cause another earthquake. So it could happen again. And not only that, a 2020 survey given out to Lisbonians. Lisbonians?
Is that how you say it?
I don't know. I'm not sure, but I'm going to go with it. Lisbonians. The 2020 survey showed that most people in Lisbon would make the same mistakes that their counterparts in 1755 did.
Oh, that's a little chilling.
I think a lot of what I like about this story is that we have a lot to learn from history, both in how we think about things and how we react to things and how we learn from things. So that's it. That's my story. The 1755 earthquake. What'd you think?
I really liked it. On your last comment, I do think it's remarkable how often we don't take the lessons from history.
We really don't as often as we should. It's fascinating that we've come so far, but not that far at all.
Thank you for sharing. That was quite a tale.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you liked it, we would really appreciate it if you would like and review the podcast. That's one of the number ways you can help us at this point. We have social media. Feel free to follow us on any of them. We have a website, catastrophe-chronicles.com, and that's where I put the show notes and my sources. So if you want to read the books that I read and things like that, that would be awesome. We're looking forward to seeing you guys next week. I don't know what I'm doing yet, but I'll find something. It'll be fun.
I can't wait. All right. Stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.